They were about to zip tie a screaming 10-year-old girl in first class. Not because she was dangerous, because she was mute, and no one understood what she was trying to say. 200 passengers watched her slam the window like she'd lost her mind. Her billionaire father couldn't calm her. The crew reached for flex cuffs. Then a poor boy from economy stepped into the aisle and said one sentence that changed everything. "Stop! She's not attacking you, she's trying to save you." Because what Maya saw outside that window wasn't turbulence, it was fire. The atmosphere inside the first-class cabin had shifted rapidly from uncomfortable to suffocatingly claustrophobic. 10 minutes prior, the captain had illuminated the fasten seatbelt sign with a polite chime, warning of rough air. But what they were experiencing now wasn't just rough air, it was a violent atmospheric assault. The Boeing 777 shuddered and groaned under the invisible fists of the storm raging outside. Overhead bins rattled ominously like bones in a box, and the lights flickered in a strobe-like rhythm that only heightened the primal sense of fear gripping every soul on board. In the midst of this mechanical chaos, the most terrifying sound wasn't the wind howling past the fuselage, nor the straining engines. It was the guttural, choked sounds coming from seat 3A. Maya Sterling, 10 years old and heiress to a fortune larger than the GDP of some small countries, was fighting a battle that no one else could see. Because Maya was mute, her terror had no voice. It had no release valve. While other children might have screamed, "Mommy!" or "Help!" Maya's panic remained trapped inside her chest, building pressure until she exploded physically. Her eyes, wide and swimming with tears, were fixed on the black void of the window. She wasn't just looking out, she was staring at something with a paralyzed, horrific intensity. Her small palms slammed against the triple-paned plexiglass. Thud, thud, thud. A frantic, rhythmic drumming that sounded like a heartbeat gone wrong. Sweat matted her dark hair to her forehead, and her breath came in sharp, hyperventilating gasps that sounded like a wounded animal. Beside her, James Sterling felt a kind of helplessness he had never experienced in his life. As the CEO of Sterling Global, James was a man who commanded rooms, shifted markets, and solved impossible problems with a signature on a check. He was used to control. But here, at 35,000 feet, trapped in a metal tube being tossed by a storm, his billions were worthless. He couldn't buy smooth air. He couldn't bribe the turbulence. And most devastatingly, he couldn't buy his way into his daughter's mind. "Maya, sweetheart, please!" James pleaded, his voice cracking. He unbuckled his seatbelt, ignoring the flight attendant's glare, and tried to wrap his arms around his daughter's thrashing frame. "It's just turbulence. It's just the wind. Daddy is here." But Maya fought him off with surprising strength. She shoved his chest, her face contorted in frustration. She wasn't trying to push him away because she was angry. She was trying to push him toward the window. She pointed frantically at the glass, her mouth opening in a silent scream, her fingers signing something rapid and messy in the air. But James, drowning in his own anxiety and never having fully committed to learning American Sign Language after her mother passed, only saw flailing. He saw a child having a meltdown. He didn't see the warning. He saw the symptom, not the cause. "I know you're scared, I know!" James shouted over a sudden drop in altitude that made stomachs lurch. "But you have to stop hitting the window! You're going to hurt yourself!" The reaction from the surrounding pod seats was swift and merciless. Fear has a way of stripping away the veneer of civilization, and the wealthy passengers of first class were scared. They didn't see a terrified, disabled child. They saw a threat to their already fragile safety. "For God's sake, Sterling, control your child!" A man in a bespoke suit barked from across the aisle, clutching his armrests until his knuckles turned white. "She's creating a panic! We're trying to stay calm here!" "It's ridiculous," a woman 2 rows back hissed to her companion, loud enough for James to hear. "This is why children shouldn't fly first class. Spoiled little brat is probably used to getting whatever she wants. Someone needs to shut her up before she breaks that window." The murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin like a contagion. The collective anxiety of the turbulence was being funneled into anger toward Maya. They needed a scapegoat for their fear, and the frantic, mute girl was an easy target. The empathy in the room had evaporated, replaced by a cold, survivalist instinct. They viewed her frantic signaling not as communication, but as violence. The situation reached its breaking point when the plane took another sharp, sickening dip. Coffee cups flew off tray tables, splashing dark stains onto the beige carpet. Maya, terrified that the plane was breaking apart, lunged at the window again, this time scratching at the plastic frame with her fingernails, her face pressed against the glass as if she were trying to climb through it. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Sarah, who was clearly at the end of her own nerves, unbuckled and marched over, struggling to keep her balance on the tilting floor. Her face was pale, her professional smile long gone. In her hand, she held a set of plastic flex cuffs, the kind usually reserved for unruly drunks or terrorists. "Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice shaking but firm, raising her voice to be heard over the roar of the engines. "We cannot allow this to continue. She is endangering herself and the integrity of the cabin. Passengers are terrified. If you cannot physically restrain her, I have to." "You are not tying up my daughter!" James roared, standing up to block her, his face flushed with a mix of rage and shame. "She's 10 years old! She's scared!" "She is out of control, sir," Sarah shouted back, the pressure of the angry passengers behind her weighing heavily. "We are in a severe weather pattern. I have a responsibility to the safety of everyone on this flight. Look at her! She's hysterical!" James looked down at Maya. She was curled in a ball now, rocking back and forth, grabbing her hair and pulling it, her eyes still locked on the window with a look of absolute haunting despair. She looked crazy. Even to her father, she looked like she had lost her mind. The realization broke James. He slumped, his shoulders shaking. He had failed her. He couldn't calm her, he couldn't understand her, and now he couldn't protect her from the humiliation of being treated like a criminal. "Please," James whispered, his voice broken. "Just give me a minute. Don't touch her." "I can't wait, sir," Sarah said, stepping forward with the cuffs, her jaw set. "This ends now." The cabin held its breath. The storm outside raged, but the cruelty inside felt colder. They were about to bind a terrified, mute child to a chair, and no one was objecting. In fact, they were relieved. They wanted the noise to stop. They wanted the problem neutralized. In that moment, humanity had left the first-class cabin, leaving only fear and the ugly, silent complicity of the crowd. "Don't touch her." The voice wasn't loud, nor was it aggressive. It was calm, steady, and possessed a gravity that seemed to drop the temperature in the cabin by 10 degrees. Sarah, the flight attendant, froze with the flex cuffs inches from Maya's flailing wrists. James Sterling spun around, his eyes wild with desperation, ready to snap at whoever was interrupting. But the sight that greeted them stopped everyone cold. Standing at the threshold of the first-class cabin, having pushed past the heavy velvet curtain that separated the haves from the have-nots, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old. He was black, skinny, and dressed in clothes that whispered a story of struggle. His gray hoodie was frayed at the cuffs, washed so many times the fabric was thinning at the elbows. Slung over one shoulder was a backpack that looked like a survivor of a war zone, its bottom seam held together by strips of silver duct tape that caught the flickering cabin lights. In the plush, beige and gold world of first class, Elijah looked like an error in the code. He stood in the aisle, his scuffed sneakers sinking into the expensive carpet, looking entirely out of place yet completely unafraid. "Go back to your seat, son," a businessman barked from row 2. "This isn't a show." Elijah didn't even blink. He didn't look at the businessman. He didn't look at the furious flight attendant or the billionaire father. His dark, intense eyes were locked like a laser on one thing only: Maya. He stepped forward. It wasn't a hesitant step. It was a purposeful stride that closed the distance between economy and first class in seconds. He moved past James Sterling as if the billionaire were a ghost. "Hey!" Sarah protested, reaching out to block him. "You can't be up here!" Elijah ignored her, dropping to his knees right on the floor beside Maya's seat. He didn't try to grab her hands. He didn't try to hold her down. He didn't yell, "Calm down!" over the roar of the engines. He knew that to a girl trapped in a silent world, shouting was just violent vibration. Instead, Elijah took a deep breath and raised his hands into the space between them. To the watching passengers, it looked like he was casting a spell or surrendering. But to Maya, who was mid-scream, her face twisted in agony, the movement caught in her peripheral vision like a flare in the night. Elijah moved his hands with sharp, deliberate precision. He placed both palms flat in front of his chest and pushed them downward in a slow, steady motion, the American Sign Language sign for calm. He didn't do it once, he did it 3 times. Calm, calm, calm. Then he took his index and middle fingers, pointed them at his own intense brown eyes, and then pointed them firmly at Maya. Look at me. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if someone had cut the power to a siren. Maya's thrashing stopped mid-motion. Her hands, which had been clawing at the window just seconds ago, froze in the air. Her chest was still heaving, her breath hitching in ragged sobs, but her eyes locked onto Elijah's hands. For the first time in 20 minutes of terror, someone wasn't trying to restrain her. Someone wasn't looking at her like a broken object or a dangerous animal. Someone was speaking to her. The cabin fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the rumble of the turbulence. The passengers who had been demanding zip ties craned their necks, confused by the sudden stillness. James Sterling stood paralyzed, his mouth slightly open, watching this boy in a ragged hoodie achieve in 5 seconds what he had failed to do with all his billions. Elijah didn't break eye contact. He held Maya's gaze, his face radiating a fierce, protective focus. He repeated the signs, slower this time, softening the edges. I see you, his hands said. You are safe. Talk to me. Maya blinked, tears spilling over her lashes. Her lip trembled. She looked at her father, who looked helpless, and then back at the boy, who looked like he understood. Slowly, shakily, she raised her own hands. They weren't flailing anymore. They were forming shapes. The connection was made. The barrier was broken. And in the middle of a storm at 35,000 feet, 2 children from opposite ends of the world began a silent conversation that would save them all. Maya's hands were a blur, moving with a frantic, desperate precision that only Elijah could track. To James Sterling, it looked like gibberish. To the flight attendant, it looked like a seizure. But to Elijah, it was a news report from hell. His eyes darted back and forth, reading the shapes her fingers carved into the recycled air. Bird, hit, spark, fire, wing, boom. The color drained from Elijah's face so fast it was as if he had been slapped. The soft, empathetic expression he had worn moments ago vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He didn't just understand her, he believed her. He looked from Maya's terrified, tear-streaked face to the plastic window shade that Sarah, the flight attendant, had yanked down minutes ago in a misguided attempt to calm the child's hysteria. Elijah spun around on his knees, facing the gallery of wealthy, annoyed adults. He didn't whisper this time. "The wing is on fire!" The scream tore through the first-class cabin, louder and more jarring than the turbulence itself. Elijah pointed a trembling finger at the closed window shade. "She's not crazy! She's not having a tantrum! She saw sparks! Something hit the engine!" For a heartbeat, there was silence, the kind of stunned vacuum that precedes a burst of laughter. Then, the scoffing began. It started with the man in seat 2B, the one in the bespoke suit who had demanded the zip ties. He let out a harsh, derisive laugh, shaking his head as he picked up his glass of scotch. "Oh, for God's sake," the man sneered, rolling his eyes. "First the screaming, now the fairy tales? Sit down, kid. You're watching too many movies. If the engine was on fire, the alarms would be blaring. The pilot would know." "He's right," another passenger chimed in, a woman clutching a pearl necklace. "These planes have sensors for everything. Don't let them work you up. It's just attention-seeking behavior. They're just kids." Even James Sterling, Maya's own father, looked doubtful. He wiped a hand over his exhausted face, looking at Elijah with a mix of pity and frustration. "Son, look, I appreciate you calming her down, truly. But it's pitch black outside. It's night over the Atlantic. She probably just saw the reflection of the strobe lights on the clouds. It plays tricks on your eyes." "It wasn't a reflection!" Elijah yelled, standing up now. The desperation in his voice cracked. He wasn't being polite anymore, he was terrified. "She said orange!" She said sparks. She said smoke. "Maya doesn't lie. Why won't you listen to her?" "Because she's a child and you're—" The businessman in 2B trailed off, waving a dismissive hand at Elijah's taped-up backpack and frayed hoodie. The implication hung heavy in the air. You are a poor kid from Coach, and she is a disabled girl. Your reality doesn't matter here. Sarah, the flight attendant, stepped forward, her patience finally evaporated. She placed a firm hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Okay, that's enough. You've caused enough of a scene. You need to return to your seat immediately, or I will have the air marshal escort you. There is no fire. The captain has everything under control." "Check the window!" Elijah pleaded, shrugging off her hand. He lunged toward seat 3A, his hand reaching for the plastic latch of the shade. "Just look!" "No!" Sarah blocked him, placing her body between the boy and the window. "Sir, grab him!" she signaled to James. "We cannot have passengers opening shades during a potential emergency procedure. It's against protocol." "It's not protocol. It's suicide to ignore her," Elijah shouted, fighting to reach past the stewardess. Maya was signing frantically again behind him. "Hurry! Hot! Melting!" Her silent screams vibrating with urgency. "Sit down!" the businessman roared, unbuckling his belt to intervene. "Get that delinquent out of here!" "Dad!" Elijah looked at James Sterling, his eyes burning with a fierce, challenging intensity. "You didn't listen to her when she was crying. Are you going to listen now? If she's wrong, I'll go back to my seat. I'll let you tie me up. But if she's right, and you don't look, we're all going to die in these expensive seats." James froze. The raw conviction in the boy's voice cut through the layers of corporate logic and social pressure. He looked at Maya. She wasn't rocking anymore. She was pointing at the window with a terrified certainty that chilled his blood. "James, don't let him!" the businessman warned. "It's nonsense!" James looked at the flight attendant, then at the angry passengers, and finally at the boy in the hoodie who was the only person on the plane fighting for his daughter. "Move, Sarah," James said quietly. "Sir?" the attendant blinked. "I said move," James commanded, stepping forward. He didn't grab Elijah. He reached past the stunned flight attendant, his hand hovering over the plastic handle of the window shade. The cabin went deadly silent. The turbulence rattled the floorboards. "If there's nothing there," James whispered, half to himself, half to Elijah, "then this ends now." "Open it," Elijah breathed. James gripped the latch and ripped the shade upward. The plastic shade snapped up, and the world inside the first-class cabin changed forever. There was no darkness outside. There were no stars. There was only fire. A grotesque, pulsating sheet of orange flame was licking violently against the aluminum skin of the right wing. The engine wasn't just smoking, it was spitting molten debris into the night sky, a mechanical dragon dying in a blaze of glory. The heat radiated through the triple-paned glass instantly, flushing James Sterling's face with a terrifying warmth. For a split second, the silence in the cabin was heavier than the turbulence. It was the silence of brains refusing to process a nightmare. Then, reality crashed in. "Fire!" The businessman in seat 2B, the one who had mocked Elijah moments ago, let out a blood-curdling shriek that cracked his voice. He scrambled backward over his armrest, knocking his scotch glass to the floor, his composure shattering like the crystal. The cabin erupted into absolute bedlam. The polite veneer of the wealthy elite evaporated instantly. Passengers who had been sipping champagne were now clawing at their seatbelts, screaming for oxygen masks, praying to gods they hadn't spoken to in years. The flight attendant, Sarah, stumbled back, her hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with the realization of how close she had come to restraining the only person who knew the truth. Maya wasn't crazy. She wasn't acting out. She was the sentinel. She had seen the flicker before the inferno, the spark before the blaze. While the sophisticated sensors of the aircraft were processing the data, a 10-year-old mute girl had been screaming the warning with her hands, and they had wanted to tie her up for it. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" The captain's voice boomed over the intercom, stripping away the calm, customer service tone he had used earlier. We have a catastrophic failure in engine number 2. We are initiating an emergency descent immediately. Cabin crew, secure the cabin. Passengers, brace positions. Brace! Brace! The plane didn't just turn, it dropped. The nose dipped aggressively, gravity seizing everyone's stomach and shoving it into their throats. The sensation of falling was visceral and nauseating. The burning engine roared, a dying, grinding sound that vibrated through the floorboards, rattling teeth and bones. James Sterling fell into the empty seat next to Maya, his legs giving out. He looked at his daughter, his heart breaking under the weight of his guilt. He had almost let them silence her. He reached for her hand, his own trembling so violently he could barely hold on. "I'm sorry," James choked out, tears streaming down his face, lost in the cacophony of screaming passengers. "I'm so sorry, Maya." But Maya wasn't looking at the fire anymore. She wasn't looking at her father. She was looking at Elijah. In the midst of this airborne Titanic, where adults were weeping and bargaining for their lives, the two children were an island of eerie calm. Elijah hadn't run back to his seat in economy. He hadn't panicked. He had strapped himself into the empty jump seat facing the Sterlings, locking his eyes on Maya's. While the businessman in 2B was hyperventilating into a paper bag, Elijah raised his steady hands. The plane shuddered violently as the air brakes deployed, shaking the cabin like a paint mixer, but Elijah's movements remained fluid, rhythmic, and hypnotic. "We are okay." He signed it over and over, a mantra in motion. "Breathe." He placed his hand on his chest, inhaling slowly, exaggerating the motion so Maya would mimic him. "Breathe." Maya, who had been on the verge of a seizure moments ago, mirrored him. She inhaled. She exhaled. She locked her terror away and held on to the lifeline Elijah was weaving with his fingers. "We're going to die!" a woman shrieked from the back, clutching her rosary. Elijah didn't flinch. He signed to Maya, "Look at me. Only me." James watched, stunned. He saw the shift in his daughter. The wild animal panic was gone, replaced by a laser-focused trust. This boy, this stranger with the taped-up backpack, became her entire world. He was translating the chaos into a language she could navigate. He was telling her the story of their survival before it even happened. The ground rushed up to meet them, visible now through the gaps in the clouds. Dark shapes of land and the glittering lights of a city that looked too close, too fast. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical thunk that sounded like a gunshot. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" The flight attendants screamed in unison, their training taking over. James buried his head in his hands, bracing for impact. The last thing he saw before he closed his eyes was Elijah's hand reaching across the aisle gap, not to protect himself, but to cover Maya's small hand on the armrest. A black hand over a white hand, holding tight as the world burned outside. Boom! The tires hit the tarmac with the force of a car crash. The plane bounced, skidded, and screamed as the pilot fought the crosswinds and the drag of the dead engine. Luggage flew from the overhead bins, oxygen masks swung like pendulums, and the roar of reverse thrusters was deafening. But through the shaking, the screeching of metal, and the terror, the grip between the two children never broke. They rode the mechanical beast down together, connected by a silence that was louder than the explosion they had just outrun. The plane sat motionless on the tarmac, a metal whale beached in a sea of fire-retardant foam. The sirens of emergency vehicles strobed against the cabin walls, painting the interior in flashing blues and reds. The silence that settled over the passengers was heavy, a collective exhale of 200 people realizing they were still breathing. James Sterling's hands were shaking so badly he couldn't unbuckle his seatbelt. He slumped in his seat, the adrenaline crash leaving him weak. Beside him, Maya was quiet. She wasn't rocking, she wasn't crying. She was simply watching Elijah, who was meticulously packing his meager belongings back into his battered backpack. "Here," Elijah said softly, reaching over to help James with the buckle mechanism. His fingers were steady, his demeanor calm, as if he hadn't just saved the flight from a fiery disaster. As Elijah swung his taped-up backpack over his shoulder, the stress on the old fabric finally gave way. The bottom seam ripped open with a sharp zip sound. Books, pens, and a few loose papers cascaded onto the first-class carpet, landing right at James Sterling's feet. "Shoot," Elijah muttered, dropping to his knees to gather them. "Sorry." James leaned down to help, his hand brushing against a thick, spiral-bound notebook. It was cheap, the kind you buy at a dollar store, with dog-eared corners and a cover peeling away from the wire binding. But it wasn't the condition of the book that caught James's eye. It was the handwriting on the open page. It was elegant, precise, and dense with annotations. James picked it up. He couldn't help but read the heading written in bold, underlined ink at the top of the page. "The Sound of Silence. Why Nonverbal Communication is the Future of Global Diplomacy." Finalist entry: National CODA, Children of Deaf Adults, Speech and Debate Championship. James blinked, the words swimming before his eyes. He looked further down the page, scanning the opening paragraph of the speech Elijah had handwritten. "We live in a world addicted to noise. We mistake volume for power and silence for weakness. But having been raised by a deaf mother, I learned that the loudest screams often make no sound at all. To interpret is not just to translate words, it is to translate the soul of the marginalized for a world that refuses to look down." James stopped reading. The air left his lungs. He looked up at the boy in the frayed hoodie. 10 minutes ago, James had seen a delinquent from Coach. Now he was holding the manifesto of a prodigy. "You're a debater?" James asked, his voice raspy. Elijah snatched the notebook back, looking embarrassed, his cheeks flushing slightly. He tucked it protectively against his chest. "I'm on my way to the finals in London. The scholarship money, it's the only way I can afford college." "Your mother," James pressed, glancing at Maya, who was watching them intently. "She's deaf?" "Since birth," Elijah nodded, standing up and dusting off his knees. "My dad left when I was a baby. He couldn't handle the quiet, so it's just been me and her. I've been her ears since I was 4 years old. I translate for her at the bank, the grocery store, the doctor's office." Elijah looked at Maya, his expression softening into that deep, empathetic recognition that had saved her earlier. "When I saw your daughter," Elijah continued, his voice low, "I didn't see a spoiled brat like that guy said. I saw the look my mom gets when she's trying to tell a cashier something and they just start yelling louder because they think she's stupid." He gestured to his own chest, then to Maya. "It's the panic of being trapped inside your own head. Most people get scared when they see that. They want to tie it down. They want to silence it." Elijah shrugged, adjusting his backpack strap over the duct tape. "But you can't silence silence, sir. You have to listen to it with your eyes. That's what I do. It's not magic, it's just listening." James looked at the cheap notebook in Elijah's hand, then at his own daughter. For 10 years, James had hired the best doctors, the best therapists, the best nannies. He had thrown money at Maya's condition trying to fix her. But he had never actually learned her language. He had never debated the world on her behalf. He had let the noise of his business and his reputation drown out her silent screams. And here was this boy. A boy who couldn't afford a new backpack, who possessed a wealth of emotional intelligence and intellectual maturity that James, with all his billions, lacked entirely. Elijah wasn't just a good kid. He was a linguistic expert forged in the fires of hardship. He was a bridge between two worlds, a genius of connection disguised in poverty. "You knew exactly what she was signing," James whispered, shame washing over him. "About the sparks. You knew the specific signs." "Technical terms," Elijah answered simply. "I studied the ASL dictionary for mechanics because our landlord is deaf and I have to explain when the boiler breaks. Spark, fire, metal. It's all the same language if you pay attention." The cabin door opened and fresh air rushed in, carrying the smell of burnt fuel and rain. Firefighters were shouting instructions for evacuation. "We have to go," Elijah said, clutching his debate notes, his ticket to a future he was fighting so hard for. James stood up, but he felt smaller than he ever had in his life. He looked at the boy who had saved them, not with muscle, but with a mind sharpened by love and necessity. The intellectual twist wasn't that Elijah was good at math or science, it was that he was a master of the one thing the billionaire had failed at, being human. The evacuation slides deployed with a sharp hiss, unrolling like yellow tongues from the side of the crippled aircraft. One by one, the passengers slid down into the cold, damp night of the airfield, their expensive suits and dresses instantly soaked by the mixture of rain and fire-retardant foam that covered the runway like snow. It was a chaotic, shivering procession, but as feet hit the tarmac, the chaos gave way to a stunned, reverent silence. Because now, standing on the ground, they could see it. The right wing of the Boeing 777 was a charred, skeletal ruin. The engine cowling had melted away entirely, exposing the blackened, twisted metal of the turbine blades. Scorch marks streaked along the white fuselage like claw marks from a beast. It wasn't just a malfunction. It was a catastrophe that had been paused seconds before destruction. If they had flown for 5 minutes longer, if they had ignored the warning and kept the window shade down, the heat would have breached the fuel tanks. They were all standing in the shadow of a grave they had almost dug for themselves. James Sterling slid down last, holding Maya tight against his chest. When his loafers touched the wet pavement, he stumbled, his legs finally giving way under the weight of the night's terror. He looked up at the burnt wing, the smell of acrid kerosene stinging his nostrils. The reality of it made him nauseous. A few yards away, the group of first-class passengers stood huddled in emergency blankets handed out by the ground crew. Among them was the businessman in the bespoke suit, the man who 20 minutes ago had screamed for zip ties, the man who had called Maya a spoiled brat. He was staring at the blackened engine, his face pale and slack. Slowly, he turned his head and saw Maya standing there, small and shivering in the wind. Their eyes met. For a moment, James expected the man to say something, to defend himself, but the man simply crumbled. The arrogance that had defined him in the cabin evaporated. He looked down at his muddy shoes, unable to hold the gaze of the 10-year-old girl whose tantrum had just saved his life. He pulled his blanket tighter, turning away in a gesture of profound, silent shame. One by one, the other passengers followed suit, lowering their heads as they shuffled toward the waiting buses. No one dared to look at the girl they had wanted to silence. James turned his attention back to his daughter. Maya wasn't looking at the crowd. She wasn't looking at the plane. She was looking at him, her expression unreadable, waiting. James didn't care about the mud. He didn't care about the watching paramedics or the flashing lights of the police cars. He dropped to his knees on the wet tarmac, bringing himself down to her eye level, just as Elijah had done earlier. He took her small, cold hands in his. "Maya," James choked out, his voice breaking into a sob that he couldn't hold back. Tears mixed with the rain on his face. I didn't look." Maya tilted her head, watching him. "I listened to them," James whispered, gesturing vaguely at the retreating crowd of important people. "I listened to the strangers. I worried about what they thought. I worried about the noise. And I almost let them hurt you." He pulled her into a fierce, desperate hug, burying his face in her small shoulder. "I promise you, Maya, I swear on my life, I will never, ever look away again. I will learn to listen. I'm so sorry." Maya stood stiffly for a moment, surprised by her father's sudden collapse of composure. Then, slowly, she wrapped her small arms around his neck. She patted his back awkwardly. It was a gesture of forgiveness, yes, but it was also a shift in power. The helpless child was gone. In her place was a survivor who knew the truth of what had happened. Over James's heaving shoulder, Maya looked up. She found Elijah standing near the wheel of a fire truck, shivering in his thin hoodie, clutching his backpack. He gave her a small, tired nod. Maya nodded back. It was a silent acknowledgement between soldiers who had fought in the same trench. Her father was apologizing, and that was good. But Elijah had believed, and that made all the difference. The flashing blue lights of the police cruisers reflected off the wet tarmac, creating a surreal, strobe-lit stage for the aftermath of Flight 292. While the other passengers were being herded toward the terminal buses, Wrapped in thermal blankets and murmuring about lawsuits and trauma, Elijah was already moving in the opposite direction. He was checking his cheap digital wristwatch, his brow furrowed in worry. The emergency landing had diverted them to a remote military airfield outside of London. He was miles away from the city center. The final round of the CODA National Speech and Debate Championship started in 3 hours. If he missed check-in, the scholarship was gone. The months of preparation, the money his mom had scraped together, the duct-taped backpack, it would all be for nothing. He adjusted his hood, keeping his head down, trying to slip away toward the airport perimeter fence, where he hoped to find a taxi or a bus. He didn't want gratitude. He just wanted a future. "Wait! Son, wait!" The voice was desperate, cracking with emotion. Elijah paused and turned around. James Sterling was running toward him, his expensive Italian loafers splashing through puddles of oil and foam, his suit jacket ruined. He wasn't running like a CEO, he was running like a man afraid of losing something precious. James caught up to Elijah, breathless, his hands resting on his knees as he gasped for air. He looked up, his eyes red and raw. "You were leaving," James said, straightening up. "You didn't even stay for the statement." "I have to get to the city, sir," Elijah said politely, clutching his notebook straps. "My competition. If I'm late, they disqualify me. I can't miss this." James looked at the boy, this skinny, underfed kid who was worried about a debate trophy after staring death in the face. He shook his head in disbelief. "Forget the competition," James said. "I need to ask you something. I need to know." James took a step closer, ignoring the chaos of the sirens behind him. "There were 200 people on that plane," James said, his voice trembling. "Businessmen, doctors, pilots, even me, her own father. We all looked at Maya and we saw a problem. We saw a tantrum. We wanted to tie her up." He swallowed hard, the shame fresh in his throat. "But you ran from the back of the plane. You didn't hesitate. Why?" James searched Elijah's face, pleading for an answer that would help him sleep at night. "Why did you believe her when no one else did?" Elijah shifted his weight, looking over James's shoulder at Maya, who was watching them from the door of the emergency bus. He looked back at the billionaire, his eyes old and deep. He didn't need to think about the answer. It was the reality of his existence. "Because, sir," Elijah said softly, his voice cutting through the wail of the sirens, "I know what it feels like to scream at the top of your lungs and have nobody hear you." The words hung in the cold night air. "My mom is deaf," Elijah continued, "but we are poor. And in this world, being poor is a lot like being mute. People look right through you. They see the hoodie or the skin color or the tape on the bag, and they decide you don't have anything important to say. They turn down the volume on you." Elijah tapped his own chest. "When I saw your daughter hitting that glass, I didn't see a crazy person. I saw someone trying to break the soundproof glass that everyone else put around her. I knew she wasn't making noise to be annoying. She was making noise to survive. And I couldn't let her do it alone." James Sterling stood frozen. The simple, brutal truth of Elijah's words tore through him. He realized that his wealth had acted as earplugs, deafening him to the struggles of those he considered beneath him. James reached out and placed a firm hand on Elijah's shoulder. The grip was solid, a promise made flesh. "You missed your competition, Elijah," James said. "I know." Elijah looked down, a wave of defeat washing over him. "It's okay. I'll try again next year." "No," James said firmly. "You won't." Elijah looked up, confused. "You aren't going to that competition because you don't need it," James declared, his voice regaining the authority of a titan of industry, but tempered now with humanity. "I am sponsoring your education. Full ride. Undergrad, master's, PhD, whatever you want to study. Harvard, Oxford, I don't care. You will never have to worry about tuition again." Elijah's mouth fell open. "Sir, I can't accept." "It's not a gift," James cut him off. "It's an investment, because the world needs your ears more than it needs my money." James pulled a wet business card from his pocket, but before handing it over, he paused. He looked back at Maya, then at Elijah. A new idea, bigger than a scholarship, took root. "And one more thing," James said, his eyes lighting up with a vision. I'm going to start a foundation, the Elijah and Maya Initiative. We're going to fund schools for the deaf, and we're going to train hearing kids in ASL. We're going to teach the world how to listen. James pressed the card into Elijah's hand, closing the boy's fingers over it. I want you to run the Youth Advisory Board. I want you to help me understand my daughter. Will you help us? Elijah looked at the card, then at the billionaire, and finally at Maya. The mute girl raised her hand from the bus window and signed one word: friend. Elijah smiled, a genuine, wide smile that broke through the exhaustion. He signed back, yes. Yes, sir, Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion. I'd like that very much. Good, James said, wiping a tear from his cheek. Now come on, my private driver is on the way. Let's get you a ride into London. I think we both have a lot to learn from you. As the black town car pulled up to the edge of the airfield, ready to whisk Elijah away to a future that had seemed impossible just hours ago, he rolled down the rear window. The rain had stopped, leaving the tarmac glistening under the moonlight. Standing next to her father, wrapped in a silver emergency blanket, Maya raised her hand. Her fingers didn't sign a frantic warning this time. They didn't claw at the air in desperation. She simply waved. And then, for the first time since she was a toddler, the clouds in her expression cleared. Her face broke into a radiant, genuine smile, a smile that reached her eyes and lit up the dark runway brighter than any landing light. Elijah smiled back, waving until the car turned the corner, carrying him toward a new life where his voice, and hers, would finally be heard. That night, Flight 292 wasn't saved by a billion-dollar engine or a seasoned captain. It was saved by a boy with a taped-up backpack who knew how to listen to the things that were never said. We live in a noisy world that often lets prejudice plug our ears, causing us to miss the most important warnings. But as Elijah and Maya proved, kindness is the universal language, the only one that doesn't need sound to be understood. Have you ever screamed in a room full of people and felt like no one was listening? Have you ever been judged before you could even speak? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe that we should listen with our hearts, not just our ears, share this video. You never know who needs to hear it.